I'm Rick Parkhill. I'm the director of brand storytelling, and I'm delighted to introduce this group to you today to discuss a really important topic of brand journalism. Can brands tell true and honest stories, and if so, how should they go about that? So we have three trained journalists that are now brand journalists to discuss this important topic. So we're going to have time for Q&A towards the end. This is a live Zoom, so we'll invite you to come on, turn your video and audio on, ask the questions yourself, and interact with the panelists. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to my good friend Lou Dubois, who's going to moderate this conversation today. And I'm going to turn my video off and enjoy listening to the three of you. Take it away, Lou.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody, wherever you all are tuning in from. Thanks for making a little time to chat with us. We've got a really good session, as Rick talked about, on a topic that I think the three of us here on the panel are really excited to talk through. We will, as Rick said, open it up for some Q&A at the end, but figured I would start out with a little bit of a welcome / introduction, and then I'll turn over to my esteemed panelists for a couple of intros from them as well. So I think the topic here is focused on brand journalism, and brand journalism is not a new thing for all of those who have sort of been in this game for a while. The title of the seminar is really about 20 years, what we've learned and where we're going. But if you really look back, it goes even beyond 20 years. If you go back to soap operas and things that were happening in the 50s and 60s and before that. So I think in a lot of modern terms, Larry Light, who was the CMO of McDonald's in the early 2000s, is credited with really coming up with the term brand journalism in 2004. He told everybody at the AdAge conference at the time that they were going to do brand journalism, which was really their essential attempt to become a media company. The idea was really to eschew traditional marketing and advertising in favor of that content stream approach that I think all of us now know and love. That's done both by in-house teams and by agencies for multiple channels and for multiple audiences. And obviously, we've seen a lot that's changed in 20 years, but a lot has remained the same as well. So I think that brand journalism for the three of us that come from the journalism world, and we'll get into background in just a second, is a response to the fact that really any organization or company can use journalistic principles and techniques to tell their story. I think if you boil it down to very bare basics. It's not content marketing. We're going to get into that in just a minute. I'm going to tease that a little bit for Angela, who's going to give us a nice little bit on that. But I think that let's start by saying, too, when AdAge heard about this, they described brand journalism as arguably the most realistic description of marketing today, and that was in the 2000s. So again, this is not new. It comes across in many different forms, whether we talk about brand films, we talk about podcasts, we talk about written stories, we talk about photography, articles, et cetera, et cetera. But regardless of the medium, that premise remains the same. So with that, I will introduce everybody here, and I'm going to moderate the conversation. I've got some questions for the group, and I'll jump in with some thoughts as well. But we'll start with introductions. So myself, my name is Lou Dubois, as Rick said. I am a content and creative executive with a long history inside of brands and before that in media. So most recently, I worked at the Home Depot and at Hilton, where I built out and led in-house creative and content teams with a real focus on brand storytelling. Before that, I worked at NBC and a bunch of other media outlets that we won't get into. You can find them on my LinkedIn if you really need to. One of which I was lucky enough to work with our esteemed panelist, Rich Latour. But yeah, so that's my story. Rich, I will turn over to you. You want to give a little background intro on who you are?
Of course, yes. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, Lou. Yes, Lou and I crossed paths at NBC News once upon a time. Actually, it was in the early days of social media where we had some fun times together, training correspondents and sort of our fellow producers on how to navigate that what was the Wild West back then, still is to a certain extent. I was at NBC News for 17 years, mostly as a producer on the NBC Nightly News. And then I made a career switch around 10 years ago and started an in-house content marketing function at Goldman Sachs and built out an in-house production capability there. And then around 5 years ago, came over to BlackRock to do something similar over here. So I'm a recovering journalist and sort of an accidental marketer, all wrapped into one.
Love it. Thank you, Rick. Rich and Angela.
Hi, everybody. I'm Angela Matusik. When we dug into our past, we realized that we've all worked together under the same corporate umbrella at some point in our lives. I spent much of my career at Time Inc. as a journalist and as an executive at In Style and People. I worked at NBC when I was the content chief of something called iVillage, which used to be a huge content place, but at the way that media goes. About 7 years ago, I made the switch to the brand side of things, where I led the brand journalism initiative at HP, which, even though, as Lou said, this has been something that's been around for 20 years, when I joined HP 7 years ago, it was like no one had ever heard the term. And I still come across people today who are not familiar with brand journalism and who work at brands and in the marketing and communications team. And currently I run a consulting company where I work with all different kinds of clients, entertainment industry, pharmaceutical, tech companies, nonprofits, and do the same kind of stuff. So
Love
I'm
it.
really excited for this chat.
Well, I think let's start there, guys. I think since we are three recovering former, I don't know what the right terminology is for those who have left journalism but still do a form of journalistic practice. Let's talk about why we made that shift and maybe what we've learned in that time. Angela, maybe I'll start with you since you just said it's been 7 years for you. It's been 10 years for me. Rich, I don't know how long it's been for you. It's about 10 probably as
10,
well.
10 as well. Yep.
But Angela's the newest to the group then. So please tell us what you've learned and kind of why you made that big switch.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was really a career pivot. I think everybody here that's listening probably knows what's happened to the media sector and industries. And honestly, moving over to the brand side was incredibly enlightening and liberating, because we were able to focus on quality, not quantity, which is what happens to many newsrooms these days. And I just found that it was really exciting to take my journalistic skills, which honestly is leading with curiosity. So that's like the number one thing that I think anybody on your team or anybody you ever hire, like always hire somebody that's curious. And no one is more curious than a journalist. And so that was what I was able to bring to HP, which was at a tech company. I had never worked in tech before, but it was really exciting to apply all of these skills that I had learned in media and in journalism to a brand. And it's something, they are muscles that you can learn and train yourself in, but it's not something that people organically know if you haven't had a chance to do it.
Yeah. No, that's great. And we're going to get more into that because I do want to talk about some of the skills that are most critical in building teams out, both in-house and with agency partners to do this work. Rich, how about you?
So it's interesting, I started at NBC News right after school and sort of worked my way up, and I hit the 10-year mark. So this is around 2005, 2006. And I started just to get a feeling in my gut that this wasn't a place I wanted to be at forever. And it wasn't because I didn't love journalism or NBC or anything. I just felt like I had done it. And I didn't want to overstay my welcome. So, but that said, I had no idea what, as Angela sort of referred to, we picked up a very sort of peculiar skill set. And I was wondering how it would translate to the real world. And I spoke to someone who was sort of mentoring me at the time, and she told me, there's always going to be a need for storytellers. It's recession proof. And that stuck with me. And in that moment, in around 2006, I didn't really find what was next. And I ended up staying at NBC for another 6 or 7 years in a variety of different roles, which were great because I gained some, more experience. And around 10 years ago was really, when firms like Goldman at the time was starting to lean into telling their own story on their own terms and needing to use, these techniques that journalists had in order to do that, but from the inside. So that is sort of what enticed me to make the switch over. Did not know how it would go after 17 years of having, my calendar driven by a deadline. I feel like I was pretty good at procrastinating and then coming in under the wire and getting something done under pressure. I was wondering how I would adapt to being in a place where sort of the calendar was mine to control. So what I did was I sort of set up some, the only thing I knew, which was a content newsroom with the same sort of cadence of types of meetings that you set up, editorial meeting, script approval, story idea meeting, a legal meeting, and that sort of thing. And then I had a calendar throughout the week of something that actually ended up looking pretty familiar. And then hired a few people who shared my background because I, knew I wanted to hire journalists into the role, and we were off and running.
I love it. And Rich, you're probably underselling I think that ability to plan a little bit, because really in your role, especially when you were at Nightly, you would wake up every day with no idea where your day was going to go pretty much. And I think that I will say for me, that was a huge skill set shift. The daily, weekly unknown versus, kind of planning on a more long-term basis. I think for myself, really quickly, I think, ultimately that ability to work in both short and long form, but in a both short and long term approach was really critical to making the shift. I like to tell people I think I grew up in the wrong generation to work in journalism, despite my love for the craft. I think we were a generation too late in the way that a lot of things have changed in the world. And that's not a bad thing sometimes. Sometimes it can be great when change, really makes information as readily available as it has in the last 10 or 20 years. But really, as the organizational changes happen, I mean, obviously, we won't get into, sort of the shift in media, but I started my career in magazines, much like Angela. I made the shift to television in 2011, and really, those were times, as you know, Rich, where we were trying to figure out how do we become more than just a linear television network, right? How do we show up on the screens of people having their hands in their ears, et cetera, 24/7, right? And I think that was a very big challenge for a news organization and for any media company who is trying to figure out how to show up in different ways. For me, I loved my experience in news. I still, I'd be lying probably much like the two of you if there were not days that I don't miss being in a newsroom and being around some of those incredibly brilliant and smart minds. But I think that what we talked about here and what we're able to translate is really journalism as a skill as much as it is a profession. And I think to me, that was what was really incredible. I didn't know, much like Rich, that these roles were even an option, or like Angela, that brands were investing in this sort of creative and content teams until I started really kind of looking around, and I got kind of through dumb luck, sort of stumbled upon a couple of these roles and some really good networking. I think that, what I've loved now through 10 years of this is the ability to use all of those skills and storytelling chops that we talk about in journalism, but in a more creative fashion sometimes that gives you the freedom to do it in a way that you actually want to deliver results. And that's where, to me, you often would chase the next news story, right, without knowing if it's actually going to materialize into anything. And I think that ultimately, with brands, we have a little bit more of that timeline to do what we want to do. And ultimately, what I love is that I didn't want to go into the brand world purely to sell product. I didn't want to be like a transactional marketer, right? I think I probably share that sentiment with the two of you. I wanted to find a way to make brands more human, right? That was always, to me, what made brands the most unique. It's sort of how they show up in the world, how they kind of are embodied through the people who work at those companies, how their customers show up, and really ultimately what they stand for as an organization. And I think as we've gone through the last 10 years, through a lot of social, societal change, like all of those things have become more relevant, right? So I think that it's been an interesting time to work in this world. I've loved the ability to do that. As we talk about that, I'd love to get into sort of mediums and deliverables a little bit. And just a reminder for the audience to drop questions in the chat. We'll get to those sort of at the end here. Rick is going to moderate for us a little bit. I want to start with different verticals, though, because I think we talk a lot about film within this group, right? And I think film is obviously one deliverable. It's one sort of very easy way to put time and effort against a really important project. But I think that we're going to talk a lot about how this can show up in many different ways. Rich, I would love for you to start out maybe with audio. It's something that we talked a little bit about in our pre-call. Obviously, all of us listen probably to too many podcasts or different kind of audio sessions these days, but I'd love to hear what you guys are doing at BlackRock from an audio perspective?
Yeah, no, and it's a pretty it's a good internal success story. We have a podcast. It's called The Bid. It started about 5 years ago. We're coming up on around 200 episodes. 20 minutes each. The aim is to get them out weekly, and we're just it's sort of become the organic machine that could, so to speak. The the metrics are really good. We're very happy internally about them. And it's really a chance to showcase sort of longer form thought leadership content, mostly around relevant topics having to do with markets and the economy, which is sort of what our firm's bread and butter is, and it's what people expect us to be talking about. But at the same time, it also helps humanize. In addition to the benefit of going sort of direct to consumer with respect to what our thought leadership is, it just is another way for us on from an owned media perspective to get our voice out in a very effective, coherent, yet still relatively snackable way.
One really quick follow to that, Rich. I think you talked about how critically important this is for internal audiences. I think that when we talk about, and Meg Wells, who I don't know if is on the call, but is an awesome advocate for measurement here in the group, internal audiences are a huge audience that often get left behind in a lot of this work that we talk about. And so I think when you find a way to really capture those employees as well as the external audiences that you're trying to touch, I would say for a lot of the brand storytellers, it's something that can be incredibly gratifying and actually drive really a lot of the business results in a world where companies are dying for retention, right? They want people to be happy and engaged where they are. And if content can be a conduit to that, I think that's really critical. So,
I mean, this took a long time to get to, relatively speaking, but in the past year or so, we've gotten to a point where we're able to video record every episode, and then we cut clips, and yes, we put them on in paid on social and that sort of thing.
yeah.
But we also have them on in monitors around, on a program loop in monitors around the building. So people could see folks actually with the headphones doing the podcast. And it's very much like what, an experience they would have at home, listening to podcasts they prefer in their personal lives as well. So that's a good match there as well.
I think it's great. I think we used to talk about something called the Employee Engagement Index, which actually does have a value comparatively to some of the content they consume. It was something for us at Home Depot where we would measure where higher employee engagement actually led to better engagement through sales, where ultimately it was driving those numbers for them to be a better salesperson the more that they knew about the company. So we could get into a lot more of that. Angela, I want to talk with you. Angela, I think if I can kind of toot her horn a little bit, was really one of the pioneers for what I kind of came to know as brand newsrooms, right? And I think that as Rich and I talked a little bit about, she built that at HP in a way that I really think was centralized around the written article and great photography and great design. So Angela, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about why, number one, that was a big passion for you, and also how it can be done the right way.
Yeah, well, I think this goes to something that you sort of referred to a little bit earlier, which is brand journalism versus other types of brand content creation. Every brand that's out there has a blog, right? And a blog is not brand journalism. The word blog doesn't mean journalism. It actually is supposed to, originally it meant, individual opinions and experiences that people were sharing. So if you're at a brand and you think you're publishing stuff on your blog, I would consider renaming it, to be honest. And give it a title. So create like a media company like we talked about. And, the idea is that and again, what Rich was saying too, which is this idea that you're creating content that can have multiple purposes. And nothing can have more purposes than a really well-written article that's researched and fact-checked and not hyperbole, but really tells a story and is journalistic. Because you can turn it into thought leaderships. You can give it to your teams to create LinkedIn content for all your executives who aren't sure what they should be saying right now. Your CEO can create employee-wide newsletters that help bond everybody together around common themes, especially during global pandemics. It was really handy. You can take those things and turn them into social Instagram posts. We at HP would make print we would do print. We'd go back and forth from print to digital really efficiently and economically as well. But the root of it all is with a good article and a good journalist that is assigned to the article. And the difference between brand journalism and other types of content marketing is that you apply journalistic principles to the practice that you're creating. What are those? So first of all, you have multiple sources. If you are writing an article where the only sources in your article are from your brand, that is not journalistic. If your brand is being mentioned in the title and in the first few sentences of that article, it is not brand journalism. It's promotional marketing. You should fact check it and make sure that everything is accurate. No hyperbole, which brands love hyperbole. We love to brag about things and make things sound better than they are, not in brand journalism. And I think that you mentioned visuals, I think is a really important part of it because, we all know the importance of a strong image, especially if you're trying to attract an audience, internal or external, to read something that might take their valuable time. So you always need to have a compelling image. And I would encourage people to spend a little bit of money and create original assets, not to lean in on stock photography. I mean, I remember again during the pandemic, everybody was looking for pictures that showed people working from home. I mean, didn't we all see the same images of everybody working from home across the universe? And now we're seeing the same images that represent AI, ironically enough, that if there are certain terms that they just see the same things over and over again. So create your own images. It's not that expensive to hire a journalist, a photojournalist to come in to follow an engineer for the day, to see what people are doing, or to hire an illustrator to capture a concept that's a little bit more complex in a really unique way. And again, I know we're going to talk about AI a little bit, but I would actually encourage brands to still hire creators to do these things rather than leaning on an AI creative machine to make your images for you. So you can refine your brand voice through these journalistic images.
Yeah, I'm so glad you talked about images, Angela. I always go back. There was a senior editor that was on one of my teams at Hilton, and the hero image, as a lot of us like to call them on websites, was always a challenge, right? Because it always has weird specs, and it's never a good mobile-centric image that also works really well on desktop. But I think that when we were, building and shooting and doing different visual work, we always wanted to keep that stuff in mind. And I think that, to your point, a small investment, even if small, right, can go a long way for brands in that space. So, I talked to somebody earlier today, and ultimately, we always used to lean into the idea, like, let the story decide the medium, right? Some stories don't lend themselves great to video. Some don't lend themselves great to audio. Some are best as literally just a photo gallery. Sometimes you have to look at what the story is before you decide on what you're going to do with it. And I think that ultimately, and I know this is a very video-centric group, so I think, film and episodic work is also a very important part of that. But I think if you take one thing away, it's really the idea that for us on the brand side, it's not necessarily jumping straight to video, right? I think, Rich, you and I joked about this last week, but for the amount of people who ultimately have come to us and say, hey, I want a video for X, and they have no idea why they would want a video, or if a video would actually be worthwhile for their time, like, let's have those conversations. And I think that goes both for in-house teams, but then as we work with our agency partners too, which is, I think, a critical part of this mix.
Don't commit random acts of video, and I didn't coin that. I stole that shamelessly from other conference I was at, but I have it written on my board in my office because of the times over the past 10 years where people come in breathlessly saying we need a video on X, and it's not part of any larger holistic strategy. And I think if there's been one constant over this journey, it's just been the constant it's not a negative thing, but the constant need to re-educate and educate again and re-educate stakeholders, senior stakeholders as well, on sort of redirecting them from using video as a default tactic, when in fact there might be another way that when you interrogate just a bit, you're like, no, maybe you want to consider something else.
And there is value, I would just say, about creating articles around your videos, or, like to just have a video on its own that
That's
doesn't
right.
have more foundation or tertiary content around it is a
Yeah.
wasted opportunity. Because if you create an article about the video, you can cover things that might have ended up on the cutting room floor. You're creating, SEO value, even though we know that is all in flux right now, but still, it's important. And the other thing that I think people need to realize at brands is that by creating this owned content with these, solidly journalistic articles, you're ensuring that your company's history and actions and, place in the world is documented, and you will control that. We've been seeing again and again just recently that massive archives of past media machines like MTV and different components at Time Inc. are just disappearing. So if you work in the communications team and you're relying on the media partnerships that you're doing with other organizations or on earned media to tell your brand story, it may not be there. You have
Yeah.
no control over what happens to that. So it's just important from like, it's almost like think about it as you're building this big house, and that your video series might be like the shutters that you're putting on the outside of your house. The foundation should be based in content that is reliable, accurate, factual, and evergreen, and will stand the test of time.
I think that's right. And I think what a lot of people in this group probably know, but what a lot of those sort of senior leaders that Rich talks about and Angela talks about probably don't recognize as much is how long video takes to create. I think honestly, a lot of the conversations I had in that why should we not create video conversation were you want this next week, right? And ultimately, I think, if we really lend ourselves to the creative process, and I think in working with the partners that we have, that's doing a disservice not only to the story, but the people who work there, right? And I think to look at different mediums, I think I'm glad you touched on the SEO piece of this, because I think that, video without text in this kind of AI world, which we'll come back to in a second, who knows what Google is going to find when they search for different things, right? And I think ultimately, other AI platforms, I think it's really interesting what we don't know as much as what we do as we kind of move through the next few years. And so you as a brand, protecting that brand identity and brand value is going to be most critical. And I think the more ways you can do that, the better.
My,
Um,
my husband, who works for a hospital as a content creator, he always says, "Do you want it fast or do you want it good? You can't do both."
well, it's the old premise, right? It's fast, quick, and cheap. You get 2 out of 3. So let's move a little bit, and I promise we'll get to questions probably in about 10 minutes here. So um, we talked a little bit in our pre-call about building teams, right? And I think for a lot of the folks here, it's really relevant to get into because I think we share a lot of similar sort of approaches to this. What is the right mix for you guys? So how do you build out these brand journalism teams in-house? What are the right skill sets? We talked about hiring journalists a little bit earlier, but what do your teams look like? And then I think as a secondary to that, maybe how do you rely on your agency partner to supplement those teams? I'll let either of you take it to start.
I can start. So what I've done is just as we've built these internal newsrooms is, and it is more multimedia focused rather than, there are teams around these firms that do a lot of written content. They're just not embedded in marketing. They're sort of, with marketing that's sort of targeting top of funnel, with the top of funnel strategy. So what we needed to do is take all the, some of the highlights of the thought leadership that's being produced already around these firms and reimagine it sort of for more general audiences, partly as an SEO play, way back when, but also just as a play to raise awareness and as a way to create an archive of story content, to Angela's point, that could sort of help, sort of always be there and help insulate the brand when needed. So if we knew we wanted to do a video strategy, then I hired video sort of producers who came out of journalistic shops, much like myself, because as Angela remarked earlier, it's like the attributes and how journalists I find approach finding stories, curiosity, the rigor, the automatic sort of fact checking as a default and not just relying on what folks are saying, particularly as you're talking about your own brand, is critical in order to, be as both authentic as possible, but also to have credibility with your audiences that are taking time to engage in the content, and most importantly, not insulting them. So that's been now it's like, two producers, an associate producer. We have a small team in Europe as well, and it's sort of a mirror reflection of that. An audio producer who handles the podcast and produces, writes, does the pre-calls, and even edits it on their own as well. So that's what it looks like here from a content production perspective. And then just to answer your question, we have agency support to handle overload. So when requests come in, and we try not to be order takers. We try to drive our own editorial strategy, but there is a lot sometimes to deliver. So then we do have a production partner who's sort of more or less on a always on retainer, who we're able to farm stuff off of, who we've worked with for a long time, 5 years, and who knows the brand and who knows the people around here and who knows what we're trying to do, which is also important because the whole purpose of coming in-house was to drive that familiarity so that when you're doing content with senior stakeholders, they're seeing familiar faces as well, which makes for a better experience.
That's so interesting. My experience almost is like a little bit like the opposite model, which was that if we were doing things that were sort of simple or more internal, like a Q&A with an executive or introducing somebody new who just joined the company, we would handle it in-house, and we would rely on our agency to do the more in-depth exterior facing things, because we worked with an agency who specialized in journalism, and they had great contacts and writers. But we went through a really interesting process when we set up the newsroom, where a little team from the agency became part of the team that we worked with in brand. And the agency sort of was a little bit like what Rich was just saying, like, oh, they wanted to get familiar with our voice. And so we had one writer that they assigned to us, and they expected this one writer to write everything for us. And I was, as somebody fresh into the brand world, I was kind of appalled. Like, you would never have one writer write every piece. Like, if I'm doing a story on health, I want somebody who knows about health. Or, you would hire different specialists or people who had beats. And the other thing is that we really push people to have bylines, even from the agency or freelance writers. Because I think that they need to be accountable for what they're saying, and we want people to feel proud about what they're creating. Whereas some journalists, it used to be that if you did like brand journalism, it was like your dirty secret and you wouldn't want your name on it. So I think those days are over. Be proud of the work you're doing. And I also think that it's possible to be scrappy, that you can there's so many great content creators out there that you can pull in as you need. So what we did, and what I encourage other brands to do, is to try to find a way to be nimble within your own organization, which is not easy. I know, especially when you have like big procurement departments and you're trying to figure out how to onboard people. But if you can find a system that allows you to hire freelancers as you need, you can amp up during certain production times and then pull it down. And then, you're not necessarily some big red flag on somebody's spreadsheet, but you can be a little bit more nimble and really create great content when you need it by the right talent at the right time.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear both of your perspectives. I think, I guess my experience is a little bit of both of those. I think I would start by saying there's not a one size fits all solution for, all brands when it comes to building out these functions. I remember when I got to Hilton, I was one of one to start. And so, I relied heavily on my agency partners, but then we also built that team out to be 4 different pods globally, kind of what Rich was talking about, of similar structured people. So you might have a producer here, a writer there. And I think that to go the other end of the spectrum, I had 46 people on my team at Home Depot that, were really focused on a variety of different tasks. But I think in both places where agencies played a critical role was both in that overrun that you talk about, but also in some of the larger projects. I think that especially for this community, films take time, as we talked about earlier, to create. And I don't necessarily have the ability to pull 4 or 5 or 6 or sometimes more people off of all of those other projects that might be going on internally to have them focused on this singular longer form initiative. That doesn't mean it's less important, right? That's sort of where agencies to us were really critical. We also had an agency, much like you, Angela, who we hired to do a lot of the editorial for us. And they didn't, thankfully, we didn't hire one person, we hired a few. But I think that, it is so critical for any agency partner to understand the brand before they start that project, right? And I think that's why, obviously, there's agency retainers and things of that nature. But I think that it goes so much more beyond the story itself. It's those internal political conversations you need to have, those internal bureaucratic things that come up as you go through this. And then, as we talked about earlier, but ultimately we won't get into on this call, but measurement and distribution, making sure that all of that is in line with ultimately what the work you're creating is for. I think, I know I have a strong opinion on this, and I think both of you do too, but like, we would not take on a project if it didn't have a distribution plan before it was started, or B, the same amount of money set against, pushing it out as it was to create it. And ultimately, a lot of brands struggle with that still. I think there's an ability to spend a lot of money on the creative, but then it gets left behind because ultimately they didn't have any money left to push it out. So
it's a Hail Mary hoping organic will carry the day, right? And
totally.
Particularly for brands that are new to this, you need that paid to sort of turbocharge, at the very least, your way into awareness.
Yeah, I would always say nobody wakes up in the morning and says, "Gee, I wonder what HP has to say today."
Yeah, totally. We used to talk about, and I don't know if it was similar for you guys, but if we were going to, take a full budget, 60%, let's say, went against production, at least 40% had to go against distribution, if not equal, right? And I think that ultimately that was a standard we really tried to stick to. So one last question from me, maybe one quick fire after that before we get to audience questions. I'd be curious from both of you. We talked a little bit about your experiences, but what in your mind do most brands get right, and what are brands getting wrong as we look at this space today and maybe as we move forward?
I would give a shout out to the brands that I think that are doing really good service. Like, I think a lot of the financial institutions do great service work, explaining like complicated things to new investors, things like that. I like what Square has been doing for small business owners to give them advice. I think that's like often a forgotten thing. And, traditionally in every job I've ever had, when you do a good how-to story, it always performs well. Because, the most important thing is your audience's time, and they want to know what they're getting from the time they're spending by reading your article or watching your film or video or listening to your podcast. So if within that you're making their life better or helping them make a decision, it's a real win. And again, I would think that, to me, I think the thing that is brands are sort of sometimes lose sight on is they just seem like they're just creating to just create. And sometimes it seems like, like that lesson, like quantity is not quality, needs to be considered. Just because you can make all of this content and you have the budget and the team, whatever, doesn't mean you should. So really take a good look at what is the right cadence, like what right do you have to speak about these things? And is your voice a desired voice in the space where you're speaking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Less is more. So, I'll start on that point. And I agree wholeheartedly with Angela. And that's sometimes, everyone who wants to do everything just because you can is not necessarily the best strategy. And even though we both have, we have brand newsroom, content newsroom sort of in our titles, it doesn't mean that you need to try and literally be a news organization and sort of chase the day's news. And sometimes it's easy to fall into that trap where, something will happen on markets and you try and turn something around quick. And to Lou, your point earlier, but if you're not going to put paid behind it, then it's not really worth the production time. But then by the time you get paid activated, it's already, past its due date. So really focusing on evergreen, I think, is always worked better for the teams I've worked with. And then, I go back actually, Lou, not to put you on the spot, but to, a very memorable series. Angela talked about service journalism. This is just like good human storytelling. And Would You Do It Hilton, room 704? Was that it? Do I have that number right?
702, yes.
702, right? So the Hilton in Amsterdam, was it?
Yeah,
Where
I can give the quick
Okay, go. Yeah. I
summary on
mean,
it.
just memorable. And it was like, 4 or 5 years ago. And I remember I used that as a bar for, wow, if BlackRock could be involved in something like that, that's just really strong human storytelling backed by a brand. I think that's cool, but I'll let you take 30 seconds on it.
Yeah, super quick. I think and Room 702 is still out there if you guys want to go and watch it on the Hilton Honors YouTube channels. I think they've moved it around a few times on me to Angela's point of archives being moved. Yeah, it was a series that, interestingly enough, we launched because it was the 50th anniversary of John Lennon and Yoko Ono's Bed In for Peace, which was held at the Hilton in Amsterdam. And we had a conversation internally, which was like, do we just want to like push out a photo and say that this happened at the Hilton in Amsterdam, or do we want to make this a moment, right, and do something really cool with it? And so room 702 was the room that they had stayed in. And we used the opportunity to actually profile people who worked at the company who were living the values that John and Yoko were really preaching at the time. So we had an immigrant who had moved to Germany from Afghanistan, and sort of how the hotel world had changed his life both in and outside of work. We had a housekeeper in Florida who was the champion for our soap recycling program, and ultimately what that meant for her family back in the Dominican Republic, which she had never seen the impact until we flew her down there to see the impact. And so I don't know. I won't go on. Go watch it if you guys want. It was a great project. But I think that the point I would make on that, and I think really why that worked for us, is two things. One, we had a paid strategy before we started. We also knew that this was going to have a huge earned media interest because we were getting a lot of inquiries from media already in the lead up to that anniversary to say, hey, is there anything you guys are doing with this? And I think that tapping into cultural moments is something that we often talked about. I wouldn't call it, gosh, what was the term? Some people call it newsjacking sometimes, right? But I think that ultimately it's knowing what the social conscience is talking about sometimes to be relevant as a brand. And I think, I will shout out a couple of brands quickly. I think knowing your voice, knowing who you're trying to talk to is so critical. I think that a brand like Oatly does an amazing job at this to me. I continue to just be blown away by their advertising campaigns and sort of the alternative milk category, which crap wasn't a thing 10 years ago, right? But I think that what they do is really cool. We talked about podcasts. I'm going to shout out Inside Trader Joe's remains one of my favorite podcasts of all time from a business perspective. I think they're at 70 episodes or something now, but it really peels back the onion on what makes these companies tick. And so all that to say, there's not one way to do it right. There's one way to do it wrong. But I think that it's fun to watch the space evolve a lot too. So, all right, Rick, I'm going to bring you in because I think you might have a question.
Yeah, I do actually have a comment to start with. We're going to have Ramon Soto at Elevate in a couple of weeks. He's the CMO at Northwell Health, which is the largest employer in the state of New York, I've just learned. But they have a new documentary out on HBO. It's One South. You should check it out. It's the story of their psych unit. And so Ramon will be there to talk about that and other projects they've done with Netflix, et cetera. But it reminds me of a conversation that we had with Ben Proudfoot a couple of weeks ago, who told us that, up front with clients, when he's the master of short form documentary films. Up front with his clients, he makes sure that they are brave enough and willing enough to follow the story wherever it will go. And I think that's a really important thing. And I'd love to hear you guys comment on that, is that the journalistic rigor as it applies to brands and how important that is to be willing to tell real and honest stories.
I love that quote of course, Ben would say that to you,
Yeah,
Rick.
right.
He's so right, especially for documentary films like his. It's very important. I mean, that's another reason just to say, like, as Lou was talking about the value between, or how do you choose between a video and an article? I feel like an article allows you to do some of that legwork and to investigate and see where the story is going to go. And then you can decide if it needs to graduate to a film. But sometimes I always love to ask clients, like, what's the story of your brand that you've never been able to tell or that you think is bubbling that and sometimes it might be something that takes a really long time. Like I remember at HP, we did a story about a school for the blind where we were getting special equipment to help the kids like walk around campus and do things. And took forever because we had to get the content to them or they had to test everything. Like you just have to be patient and see what happens. And if it was a bad story, if like all the kids came back and said that they hated the equipment and that it wasn't helping them, we would probably not tell it. We would just not spotlight it.
Yeah.
So, but we didn't make that big of an investment, but it ended up being a beautiful story that had great photography and it really worked. But I don't know, it takes patience. I think that's another thing that Ben might be implying a little bit about letting the story evolve. But just know that you can't always do it in like a short turnaround. Sometimes things need to simmer a bit.
I would add from my side before Rich, maybe you jump in. I think as much as we love to sort of say, let the story follow itself and fall into place, like at the end of the day, you're a brand and there are legalities that you have to follow. I will tell you, and this is not something I've shared publicly, but I've had many projects where the best stuff got cut because it was not within sort of the brand's legal sort of acumen. And that was a bummer as a creative person. I was like, shit, that was the best part of this entire thing. But that's a reality too. So I think that it's a balance, right? I think to your point, Rick, like ultimately, you want to you don't want to dictate the story. And I think that's really what you're kind of hinting at here as a brand person. You want to let the stories kind of tell themselves as you go through the process. But just know that it still does have to kind of like adhere to some brand standards in some of these cases, particularly, and I would say, especially when I was working in some of these past bigger companies, the Home Depots and the Hiltons of the world, when you're putting paid behind it, there are a lot more restrictions around what you're able to promote then as a brand. So what may be editorially okay, when you start putting commercial dollars behind, as a whole other implication from a legality perspective. So those were things I didn't know existed before I started working in this world, but it's been really fascinating to learn as well.
No, and I would just add on that because I agree with both of you 100%. But when you add on the layer, Rick, of being in a regulated industry and trying to do some of this stuff, and you don't really, it isn't so easy to just have the luxury to say, yeah, wherever it goes, and we'll do it. Unfortunately. So, but I always warn folks as they are interviewing for these jobs, sort of at these places, that that is sort of a something walking in the door, and I actually lean into it and make a virtue of it as a challenge in terms of working with your partners in compliance to get around that, which we've actually been able to do. We are putting out stuff now that they would have been very hesitant about 3 years ago, but as we became known quantities and as we sort of increased trust in terms of how we told stories and how it reflected on the brand, we've been able to figure out ways to get some more creative stuff out there that we're proud of.
Befriending your legal and compliance teams is like my favorite thing to do inside of these brands, because you can't get this stuff done without them, honestly.
They're critical partners.
Hey, let's get to a couple of our audience members. I know Don Meek is on and has a question or a comment for you. Don, introduce yourself first.
Hey, I'm Don Meek. I work with a New Earth project in Atlantic Packaging. And I just have to tell you how much I truly appreciate this session. This is amazing. So yay for you all. Here's my question. As journalists, was it challenging for you to move into this new brand world where, and this may be a simplistic view of it, but as journalists, your KPI was readership or viewership to your content, ratings or readership or a rising subscription rate for the daily newspaper, whatever it might be. And it seems to me in the brand world, yes, that's important. but there's also a transaction of some kind that you're looking to create, or there's some KPI beyond the number of views that something gets. Was that a hard thing for you to be able to navigate into? Did it feel like you were compromising your journalistic ethics by saying, and we need to drive a sale, as an example?
I've not, where I've touched in marketing, it hasn't been to sell product.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but that's not to say that, we don't have, hopes, dreams, and desires that the sort of high level storytelling that we do doesn't at some point have commercial impact down the road. Part of the education and re-education that I was talking about earlier is also, setting expectations that just because we're going to deliver a piece of content today does not mean it's going to show up in our earnings next quarter, and that this is really a game about long-termism.
Yeah.
And not a quarter by quarter game that many public companies are very focused on. So to answer your question, it never really was an issue for me coming on. At the end of the day, what used to be, yes, wanting to work for a broadcast that had the most viewers, and expecting that week in, week out, is now just translated to, are we driving awareness with the content that we're producing, and just making sure you have the resources dedicated to being able to measure that. Otherwise, you're flying blind.
And
I would
I was
go
gonna say,
ahead.
I was gonna say I would add that one of the things I talked earlier about like how you sort of are training your colleagues within a brand about journalism. One of the journalistic ethics that you bring to a role like this is to think audience first. So that very instinct that you have about like thinking about your audience should not go away. And whether your audience is your employees or a potential client or somebody who's looking to get new equipment or buy your product, you're still thinking about them and how your story is interrupting their day and their life and why it's worth their while. So as long as you do that, you will have the measurements that you need. And, and this type of content fits in the funnel. It's at the top of the funnel. It's not the thing that people are putting products in basket for. Very rarely. It doesn't mean that it can't work that way, but it has to complement all these other kinds of marketing.
I would add, I think Rich might have to jump in a second, so we may take another question or two without him. But I would say, from my side too, it's understanding, Don. It's a great question. There are moments where when you go into this world of brand from the journalism side, you're like, shit, did I just go to the dark side, right? And there's still probably moments where we all ask that of ourselves. I will actually take the other side of that, though. I think that, to your point about measurement, I actually found, because of the metrics and sort of the systems we have in place from a brand marketing perspective inside of companies, that I actually get a lot more clarity on impact now than maybe when we were producing news stories. And I think that ultimately that's where, and that's not to shit on Nielsen or any of the other rating systems that are out there, but like that's just a number, right? And ultimately, when you're able to measure brand impact, brand lift, brand awareness, brand sentiment, things like that like, they weren't things I even knew existed until I got into this world. And that to me is really gratifying as a content creator, because you're able to see the impact your work has that ultimately might be a bottom of the funnel or a top of the funnel driver. But again, I think it might take 6, 12, 18 months to get there sometimes.
Hey, we're going to say goodbye to Mr. Latour. Rich, thanks so much.
Sorry to run
on
to my next thing,
but be
but
on time for your next
this was great.
appointment.
Okay.
We'll
Thanks,
see you
gang.
soon, Rich. Thanks so much.
That went by fast.
Yeah, this did. Excellent job. Thank you. Hey, Lou, we've got a question from Vince Beeden.
Yeah, Vince, do you want to go on video, or do you want me to read it?
Come on and introduce yourself.
Sure, yeah, thank you. I had a couple of questions. One was aimed at Angela, just having the experience in the nonprofit world. I'm really interested, because you live in both domains. I'm interested to know whether you have to do quite a big selling job and to the C-level about what your communication objectives and aims are, and what stories how you put those stories out. I am a social impact filmmaker, so I work a lot in the nonprofit world, foundations and so on. So I'm really interested in the difference and how you might push things out with content objectives.
Well, it's great to meet you, Vince. It is it's a little bit of a different world in the nonprofit space, where instead of in a brand space where maybe you're talking about product marketing or trying to get products in baskets, it's like fundraising. But honestly, by the time I'm getting called in to work with a company or a brand or a nonprofit, I'm usually being hired by the C-suite who is trying to uplift their storytelling, so I can be part of like the change agent within an organization. But I find that nonprofits move even slower than commercial brands. It's insane how slow they move. And there are many, many layers of, politics and ways of doing things. And part of it is because fundraising is so crucial. And so if there's like a system that's been working for years for fundraising, but maybe somebody wants to try something new in storytelling, the question is, well, is that going to impact, or is that money that I was using to tell these types of stories, it generates fundraising and donations. Now we're going to put it over here and it's more gray. But I would say that for the C-suite, the thing is, like, most organizations need to be able to speak to multiple layers of donors, whether it's like an individual who's doing something quickly, like an action, similar to putting a product in a cart, clicking a donate button, they're going to give right now, they're moved to donate. But then the other angle of that is you're trying to court future partnerships or corporate partners or bigger donors who want to know what your bigger picture world view strategy is. And those types of people require bigger thoughts, more explaining. And so I think that there's a space for some organizations to have both of those sort of down funnel, quick donations, and then bigger picture, like, here's our philosophy, how we're changing the world, how we fit into the world, and how we're impacting the biggest issues facing the world today. Did that help?
Thank you. I don't know. It does. It makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks. Lou, do you have any closing comments? We're right up on 59 minutes right now. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I know we're right at time. I would just say thank you to Angela and Rich, who's obviously not here. I think happy to continue the conversation. All three of us, you probably can find us all and reach out. I think that this is a really interesting time for this space, right? I think ultimately as we continue to evolve, what the brand journalism, brand entertainment, brand storytelling conversation is, I think coming at it with this journalistic approach is going to be something you hear a lot more about. So really appreciate you, Rick, making the time for us to have this chat, and for all of you guys for tuning in. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to both of you, and Rich too. You'll see the recording. Hey, next week we have another great session coming up with Jay Goodman and John Kaplan from Super Connector. We're going to talk about that busy intersection of entertainment and marketing that's kind of all brought on by, well, the last 20 years, but the Barbie moment that was experienced by so many this year. So tune in next week for Jay and John's show with Super Connector. Thanks, everybody.